was a dark, blustery evening on the island of Sodor. Sir Topham Hatt had to close the railway early due to the weather. The engines were waiting for the signal to return to their sheds. "Maybe one of us should tell a story to pass the time," Thomas suggested. The other engines looked pleased with Thomas's idea. "I have a perfect story for tonight," James volunteered with a sly grin. "A long time ago," he began, "there was a brave little engine who was always eager to help. One night, the station master asked, 'Would you go to the end of the tracks to pick up a coach that was left behind?' 'Of course,' the brave, eager engine replied, and he set out in the dark, foggy night. But by the time the little engine reached the end of the tracks, the fog was so thick he could hardly see anything. 'I'll just have to wait until morning,' the engine said to himself, and he settled into an old shed for the night. Later that night, the little blue engine awoke to a noise coming from below the shed. He opened his eyes and saw long fingers reaching for him through the floorboards. There was a monster under the shed. Terrified, the little blue engine raced out of the shed with the horrible engine-eating monster chasing him through the fog. "Then what happened?" Percy asked timidly. "That's where the story ends," said James. "No one ever heard from that little blue engine ever again." "What about the monster?" Percy asked. "Don't be silly, Percy," Gordon said with a chuckle. "It's just a story." Later that night, after they had settled in for bed, the engines were startled by a terrible racket coming from Percy's berth. "Gordon, Thomas, help! There's a monster in my shed!" Suddenly, James appeared, roaring laughter. He had been rattling some scrap metal behind the sheds to frighten Percy. James laughed. Percy was embarrassed for making such a fuss. "It's okay, Percy," said Henry. "Sometimes good imaginations think bad thoughts." Later that night, Thomas woke up with a fright. He heard a strange noise. "Stop it, James!" he yelled. But James was sound asleep. Scratch, scratch. "If it's not James, then maybe I really do have a monster under my shed," thought Thomas, and he stayed awake all night. Thomas was awfully tired when he met Percy at the docks next morning. "Did you hear any other strange noises in your shed last night?" Thomas asked. "Not after James's silly prank," Percy replied. Now Thomas felt silly himself for staying awake all night. By the end of the day, Thomas barely had enough steam to make it back to the yard. The other engines were telling stories again, but Thomas headed straight to bed. Sometime that night, Thomas woke up with a fright. The noises were back, and they were definitely coming from under the shed. "Who's there?" Thomas whispered into the dark. "It's just outside the door," Thomas yelped. "There's its head!" "Help, Gordon!" Thomas whispered, but only the monster heard him. Then the doors of Thomas's shed began to rattle in their hinges. "It's trying to get in," thought Thomas. Then, suddenly, the banging stopped. Thomas was too frightened to move. He peered out into the dark, and there it was! The horrible engine-eating monster! Thomas could see its eyes glowing into the night. Thomas shut his own eyes and screamed, "Gordon, Henry, Emily, Percy, James!" he cried. "Save me from the monster!" "Thomas," Gordon said, laughing, "open your eyes." "What are you laughing at, Gordon?" snapped Thomas. "There's a monster right outside my shed." "Not anymore," Gordon replied. "Now the monster is inside your shed." Thomas opened one eye very slowly. "A hedgehog?" Thomas said in surprise. "I was afraid of a tiny little hedgehog." Now the engines all laughed, and Thomas laughed with them. Percy had a good imagination, Thomas, but I think yours is even better. Gordon chuckled. I think you're right, agreed Thomas. It's the only thing in the world that could turn a tiny hedgehog into a big scary monster. Then they all laughed, and they all went to sleep like good friends should.